The crowd roared louder than ever before, a sea of flashing lights and screaming voices shaking the very walls of the arena as Elvis Presley stepped onto the stage. The moment felt electric, almost unreal. His iconic walk, the confident smile, the signature tilt of his head. Everything was exactly how the world expected it to be. This was the Elvis millions believed they knew. The king, the legend, the untouchable star. But what if that version of Elvis wasn't entirely real? What if the man standing under those bright lights was only a carefully built image, something created not just for fame, but for survival? Behind the curtains, before the music even began, something strange often happened. People who worked closely with Elvis had whispered about it for years. They said he would sit quietly, sometimes completely still, staring into nothing. His energy felt different, almost distant, like he wasn't fully there. Some nights he barely spoke at all. Then suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped, he would rise, adjust his outfit, and walk toward the stage. And in seconds, he transformed. The shy, quiet man disappeared, replaced by the bold, magnetic performer the world adored. It was so sudden, so perfect, that it left even insiders unsettled. Fans never saw this side. They only saw perfection. They saw confidence, charm, and power. They saw a man who seemed born for the spotlight. But those closest to him knew the truth was far more complicated. Fame had built a version of Elvis that the world demanded to see, and over time, that version began to take over. There were moments when even Elvis himself seemed unsure where the real person ended and the performer began. It wasn't just acting anymore. It felt like something deeper, something almost like a separation. Years later, Marie Presley would begin to speak about these moments, but not in the way people expected. She didn't talk about fame or success. She talked about silence.
She described watching her father in those quiet seconds before a show, how his eyes looked different, how his presence felt heavy, like he was carrying something no one else could see. As a child, she didn't fully understand it, but she felt it, and that feeling stayed with her for the rest of her life. There were nights, she hinted, when the man who walked onto the stage didn't feel like the same person who sat backstage just minutes before. Not physically, but emotionally. It was as if Elvis had learned to step out of himself, to become what the world needed him to be. Every movement, every smile, every note, it was perfect. But perfection came at a cost, and that cost was something no audience could ever see. The world believed they were watching the real Elvis, but according to those closest to him, the truth might be far more unsettling. The stage didn't just reveal him, it may have hidden him. The man behind the legend was slowly fading into the background, while the character of Elvis Presley grew bigger, louder, and more powerful with every performance. And the most chilling part? Almost no one noticed. This was only the beginning of a story that would remain hidden for decades, a story that Marie Presley would eventually bring into the light, but even she would struggle to explain it completely. Because what she witnessed wasn't just fame, it wasn't just pressure, it was something far more complex, something that made people question whether the real Elvis was ever truly on that stage at all. Backstage, the noise of the crowd always felt distant, like a storm happening miles away, even though it was right outside the walls. Elvis Presley would sit quietly in those moments, often alone, his head slightly lowered, his hands resting still, as if he was conserving every bit of energy left inside him. There was no sign of the confident performer the world adored. No smile, no charm, no spark. Just silence. Heavy, deep, almost uncomfortable silence. People who stood around him during these moments didn't know what to say, because it felt like anything could break whatever fragile state he was in. Some described it as calm, but others said it felt like something far more intense, like he was holding something back, something invisible but powerful. One of the musicians who worked with him for years once shared a memory that never left his mind. He said there were nights when Elvis wouldn't speak for 10 or 15 minutes before going on stage. Not a single word, not even a glance toward anyone. It wasn't anger, it wasn't focus in the normal sense. It felt like he was disappearing slowly, pulling himself away from everything around him. Then, without warning, he would stand up, walk toward the mirror, and look at himself in a way that made people uneasy. It wasn't just a quick glance, it was a stare, long and intense, like he was checking if the person in the reflection was ready. And then it happened. That moment everyone noticed, but no one could explain. The change. It was instant. His shoulders would straighten, his breathing would shift, his eyes would sharpen, carrying a kind of energy that hadn't been there seconds before. It was as if something switched on inside him, something rehearsed, something controlled, something almost separate from who he had been just moments earlier. Without saying much, sometimes without saying anything at all, he would move toward the stage, and the second he stepped past that curtain, the transformation was complete. The crowd would explode with excitement, but what they didn't realize was that the man they were cheering for didn't exist backstage just moments ago. That version of Elvis only appeared under the lights. For the fans, it was magic, pure, undeniable magic. The way he moved, the way he sang, the way he commanded every second of attention. It felt effortless, like it was simply who he was. But for those who saw both sides, it was something else entirely.
It felt like watching two different realities collide. One quiet and withdrawn, the other unstoppable and larger than life. And the line between those two versions kept getting thinner with every show. Some began to wonder if the performer wasn't just a role anymore, but something deeper, something that had started to take over. Marie Presley would later reflect on these moments in her own quiet way. She didn't describe them as shocking or unnatural. Instead, she spoke about them as if they were simply part of her childhood, something she had seen so often that it became normal. But even in her calm tone, there was something else, something heavier. She remembered watching her father before performances, sensing that shift even as a young child. She couldn't explain it back then, but she could feel it. The difference, the distance. The way the room itself seemed to change when he was preparing to go on stage. It wasn't just about getting ready. It felt like he was becoming someone else entirely. Inside Graceland, the contrast was even more noticeable. There were no screaming fans there, no bright lights, no expectations to be perfect. It was supposed to be the place where Elvis could just be himself. And sometimes he was. He would laugh, talk, and spend time in ways that felt normal. But there were also long stretches of silence, moments where he seemed far away, even when he was physically present. Marie would see him sitting alone, lost in thought, carrying a kind of weight that didn't match the powerful image the world believed in. As a child, she didn't understand why her father, the most famous man in the room, could sometimes feel like the quietest one. What made it even more confusing was how quickly everything could change. One moment, he was that silent, distant figure. The next, he was stepping into a role that felt almost unstoppable. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't something that built up slowly. It was immediate, like flipping a switch.
And once it happened, there was no trace of the man from before. That version of Elvis disappeared completely until the show ended. This pattern repeated itself night after night, show after show, until it became impossible to ignore for those paying close attention. Some accepted it as part of being a performer. Others saw it as a sign of how much pressure he was under. But a few started to believe something far more unsettling, that the Elvis on stage wasn't just a performance anymore. It was something he had created so perfectly, so completely, that it had taken on a life of its own. Marie never claimed to have all the answers, but her memories added something important to the story. She didn't talk about theories, she talked about feelings. She described how different her father felt depending on where he was, not just physically, but emotionally. The man at home and the man on stage didn't feel the same to her, even though she knew they were supposed to be. And that difference stayed with her, shaping how she understood him as she grew older. She realized that what the world saw was only one part of who he was, and maybe not even the most real part. As the years went on, this invisible divide seemed to grow stronger. The performances became bigger, the expectations higher, and the need to maintain that powerful stage presence more intense. With every show, the character of Elvis Presley became more polished, more legendary, more untouchable. But at the same time, the man behind that character seemed to drift further into the background, harder to see, harder to understand. It was as if the world was feeding one version of him while slowly losing the other, and no one could tell where it would end. The most haunting part wasn't the transformation itself, it was how natural it began to feel to everyone around him. What once seemed strange became expected. What once raised questions became routine. People stopped asking why it happened and started accepting that it simply did. But deep down, the mystery never went away, because no matter how many times they witnessed it, no one could truly explain what that switch was, or why it felt so complete. And as Lisa Marie would later come to understand, the answer wasn't something simple. It wasn't just fame. It wasn't just pressure. It was something much deeper, something tied to identity itself. The man the world called Elvis Presley wasn't just a person anymore. He had become an idea, an image, a force that existed beyond the man himself. And once that happened, the line between real and created didn't just blur, it nearly disappeared. There was one night, one performance, that those closest to Elvis Presley would never forget. Not because of what the audience saw, but because of what almost happened before he even stepped onto the stage. It began like any other show. The arena was packed, the energy was building. The crowd was already chanting his name, waiting for that moment when the lights would drop and the king would appear. But backstage, something was different. This time, the silence wasn't just heavy, it was overwhelming. Elvis sat in his chair longer than usual. No movement, no preparation, no quiet humming like he sometimes did before a performance. He just sat there, staring ahead, as if the world outside didn't exist anymore. The people around him noticed it immediately. This wasn't the usual calm before the transformation. This felt stuck. Time passed, minutes that felt longer than they should have. No one dared to rush him, but the tension in the room kept rising. The stage manager began to worry. The band was ready. The crowd was getting louder. Everything was in place, except Elvis. One of his closest aides finally stepped forward, speaking softly, trying not to break whatever state he was in. There was no response, not even a nod. It was as if Elvis hadn't heard him at all. The man who could command thousands with a single word now couldn't respond to the voice right in front of him. That's when the unease turned into fear. For the first time, people began to wonder if he might not go on stage at all, and that thought alone was enough to shake everyone in the room, because Elvis never missed a performance. Never. Then, slowly, something changed. He blinked. His fingers moved slightly. A small shift, but enough to make everyone hold their breath. He leaned forward, placing his hands on his knees, and for a moment it looked like he was trying to gather himself, like he was pulling something back together that had started to fall apart. But it wasn't easy. You could see it in his face, the effort, the struggle, the weight of whatever he was carrying inside him. This wasn't just pre-show nerves. This was something deeper, something that had been building over time and was now pushing back harder than ever before. When he finally stood up, it wasn't smooth like it usually was. There was hesitation, a brief pause as if he wasn't fully sure of the next step. He walked toward the mirror, but even that felt slower, heavier than usual. And when he looked at his reflection, something about it felt different to those watching. It wasn't just a check this time. It felt like a question, like he was asking himself something no one else could hear. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No transformation, no switch, just a man standing in front of his own reflection, unsure. And then, finally, it came, but not the way it always did. The change wasn't instant this time. It wasn't clean or perfect. It was forced. You could see him pushing into it, forcing his posture to straighten, forcing that familiar look into his eyes. It appeared, but it didn't come naturally like before. It was as if the version of Elvis the world expected was harder to reach that night, and that alone was enough to unsettle everyone who witnessed it. Still, When he stepped onto the stage, the crowd had no idea what had just happened. The moment the lights hit him, they screamed louder than ever, their excitement drowning out any trace of what had taken place backstage. To them, it was perfect. He sang, he moved, he performed with the same power they had always seen. But those who knew him, those who had just been in that room, could tell something was off. It was subtle, almost invisible to the audience, but it was there. Small pauses that shouldn't have been there. Moments where his energy dipped for just a second before rising again. Little cracks in the performance that only insiders could see. That night didn't end in disaster. The show went on. The crowd left happy. The legend remained intact. But backstage, after it was all over, the silence returned, and this time it felt heavier than ever. Elvis didn't celebrate. He didn't talk much. He just sat there again, quieter than before, as if the energy he had forced onto that stage had taken more from him than usual. And maybe it had. Years later, Marie Presley would recall moments like these, not always this exact night, but the feeling of them, the sense that something inside her father was constantly being pushed and pulled in different directions. She described it as watching someone carry a weight that never fully went away, no matter how strong they appeared in front of others. As a child, she couldn't understand why her father sometimes looked so distant, even after giving everything to the audience. But as she grew older, she began to see it more clearly. The stage didn't just take effort from him, it took something deeper. That night became one of many quiet reminders for those around him that the transformation everyone had come to accept wasn't as simple as it looked. It wasn't just a switch, it wasn't just a role. It was something that demanded more and more each time, something that didn't always come easily, even to the man who had mastered it. And if there were nights when it almost didn't happen at all, then what did that really mean?
Because for the first time, a question began to form that no one wanted to say out loud. What if one day the switch didn't turn on? What if the version of Elvis the world believed in simply didn't show up? And if that happened, what would be left behind? A legend without its performer? Or a man who had spent so long becoming someone else that he no longer knew how to just be himself? The crowd would never know how close they had come to seeing that reality, but the people backstage did. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. Because that night proved something none of them were ready to admit, that the line between the real Elvis and the one on stage wasn't just thin anymore. It was fragile, and it could break. By the time the world reached the peak of Elvis Presley's fame, something had already begun to change, and not in a way the public could ever notice. From the outside, everything looked bigger than ever. The shows were louder, the crowds were larger, the legend was growing stronger with every performance. But behind that unstoppable image, the man himself was slowly becoming harder to find. It didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, over time, in moments no one thought to question at first. Backstage silences grew longer. Conversations became shorter. The time he spent alone increased, not by choice perhaps, but by something deeper, something pulling him inward while the world pulled his image outward. People close to him started noticing that even when Elvis was present, he didn't always feel fully there. He would sit in rooms with others but say very little, his attention drifting somewhere far beyond the walls around him. It wasn't that he didn't care. It wasn't that he had changed into someone cold. It felt more like he was carrying something heavy, something invisible that stayed with him no matter where he went. And the only place that weight seemed to disappear was on stage. That was the strange part. The place that demanded the most from him was also the only place where he seemed free. But that freedom came with a cost, and that cost was becoming more visible with time. Inside Graceland, the contrast was impossible to ignore. This was supposed to be his escape, his private world, a place where he didn't have to perform, didn't have to live up to expectations, didn't have to be anything other than himself. And sometimes, for brief moments, that version of him did appear. He would laugh, joke, and speak with a warmth that felt completely different from the distant figure others sometimes saw. But those moments didn't last as long as they used to. Slowly, they became shorter, more rare, harder to hold on to. It was as if, even in his own home, the line between the real man and the public image was starting to blur. Marie Presley would later reflect on this in a way that felt both simple and deeply emotional. She didn't describe it with dramatic words. She didn't turn it into a mystery. Instead, she spoke about how it felt to grow up around it. She remembered seeing her father in different states, sometimes present, sometimes distant, sometimes somewhere in between. And as a child, she didn't question it. She accepted it as normal. But as she grew older, that normal began to feel more complicated. She started to realize that what she was seeing wasn't just mood or personality. It was something deeper. It was a man being pulled in two directions at once, trying to exist in both worlds but never fully belonging to either. The stage demanded perfection. It demanded energy, confidence, control, and Elvis gave it every time. No matter how he felt beforehand, no matter how heavy the silence backstage had been, once he stepped into the spotlight, he became everything the world expected, and more. That version of him didn't hesitate. It didn't doubt. It didn't struggle. It moved with certainty, spoke with power, and connected with audiences in a way few could ever match. But the more perfect that version became, the more distant the other one seemed. The quiet man, the one who sat alone, the one who didn't always speak, the one who carried that invisible weight, he began to fade into the background, overshadowed by the legend he had created. Those closest to him began to understand something that outsiders never could. This wasn't just fame changing a person. This was something far more consuming. It was as if the identity of Elvis Presley had grown so large, so powerful, that it no longer needed the man behind it in the same way. It could exist on its own, fully formed, fully alive, whenever the lights came on. And that left a question no one knew how to answer. What happened to the man when the legend took over? Where did he go in those moments? Was he still there, hidden beneath the performance? Or had he stepped aside completely to let something else take control? There were nights when this question felt impossible to ignore. After performances, when the lights faded and the crowd disappeared, Elvis would return to that quiet state again. But it wasn't always the same as before. Sometimes it felt heavier, like the effort of becoming that powerful version of himself had taken more out of him than anyone realized. He would sit in silence, not out of peace, but out of exhaustion. Not just physical, but something deeper than that. It was the kind of exhaustion that doesn't go away with rest, because it isn't just about the body. It's about the mind, the identity, the constant shift between who you are and who you have to be. Marie saw these moments. She felt them, even when she couldn't fully understand them at the time. She saw the difference between the man the world loved and the father she knew, and that difference stayed with her. It shaped how she remembered him, how she spoke about him, how she carried his story forward. She didn't try to explain it in a way that made everything clear, because maybe it couldn't be explained that simply. Some things aren't meant to be reduced to answers. They are meant to be felt, to be understood through experience rather than definition. And what she experienced was a life lived between two realities, one public, one private, one loud, one silent. As time went on, the gap between those two realities seemed to grow wider. The performances became more demanding, the expectations higher, the need to maintain that perfect image stronger. And with each passing moment, the balance became harder to hold. It wasn't just about putting on a show anymore. It was about sustaining an identity that had become larger than life, something that couldn't be turned off easily once it was on. And that meant the man behind it had less and less space to simply exist as himself. The most unsettling part wasn't that this was happening, it was that almost no one outside his inner circle could see it. To the world, Elvis was still the same. He was still the king, still powerful, still unforgettable. Nothing had changed in their eyes. But behind that image, everything was shifting. The man they believed in was slowly becoming something else. Not gone, not lost, but hidden beneath layers of expectation, performance, and pressure that never truly faded away.
And the deeper this went, the more one truth began to emerge, quietly, almost unnoticed. The stage hadn't just given Elvis his identity, it had started to replace it. The legend had grown so strong that it no longer reflected the man perfectly. It overshadowed him. It consumed parts of him. It demanded more from him than anyone could see. And in doing so, it left behind a question that would only become clearer with time. If the world only ever saw the version of Elvis that existed under the lights, then how much of the real man had they truly known? For years, the world continued to celebrate Elvis Presley, as if nothing had ever been hidden. The image remained perfect. The legend remained untouched. The performances, the voice, the presence, it all lived on in the memories of millions. And yet, behind that powerful legacy, there was a truth that had never fully been spoken. Not because it was shocking, not because it was scandalous, but because it was deeply personal and incredibly difficult to explain. Marie Presley had spent most of her life carrying that truth quietly. She didn't rush to reveal it. She didn't try to change the way the world saw her father. Instead, she allowed time to pass, choosing her words carefully whenever she spoke about him. Because what she had witnessed wasn't something simple. It wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern, a feeling, a reality that had followed her from childhood into adulthood. And when she finally began to open up about it, it didn't come out as a dramatic confession. It came out as something much more real. She spoke about her father not as the king, but as a man who lived between two worlds, a man who carried a weight that few could understand. She described how, as a child, she could sense the difference in him depending on where he was, not just physically, but emotionally. There was the Elvis the world knew, the one who stood under the lights, powerful and unstoppable. And then there was the Elvis she knew at home, quieter, more thoughtful, sometimes distant, sometimes deeply present in a way that felt completely different from the public image. And over time, she realized something that changed everything. The man on stage wasn't fake, but he wasn't the complete truth either. According to Marie, her father didn't step onto the stage as himself. He stepped into something he had created, not out of deception, but out of necessity. The expectations placed on him were enormous. The world didn't just want Elvis. They needed him to be perfect, to be larger than life, to be everything they believed he was. And to meet that expectation, he had built a version of himself that could handle it, a version that didn't hesitate. A version that didn't carry the same weight. A version that could stand in front of thousands without breaking. That version became what the world recognized as Elvis Presley. But the real man, the one behind that image, never disappeared completely. He was still there, in the quiet moments, in the silence, in the spaces between performances. He was the one who sat alone, the one who thought deeply, the one who felt everything that the stage version couldn't afford to feel. And that's where the truth became clear. The stage didn't reveal Elvis. It protected him. It allowed him to exist in a way that shielded the more vulnerable parts of who he really was. Marie didn't describe this as something negative. She didn't say her father was hiding or pretending. Instead, she spoke about it as a survival mechanism, a way for him to live under a level of pressure that few people could ever imagine. Because being Elvis Presley wasn't just a career. It was an identity that the world demanded from him every single day. And no one, not even him, could carry that identity fully all the time. So he created a space where he could step into it when needed and step away from it when he could. But even that had its limits. As the years went on, the balance between those two versions became harder to maintain. The line between them didn't just blur, it began to disappear. There were moments when the transition wasn't as smooth as it once had been, moments when the effort of becoming that powerful stage presence took more out of him than before. And in those moments, Marie began to understand something even deeper. The version of Elvis the world loved so much wasn't just something he performed. It was something that demanded more and more from him over time. And that demand came at a cost. Not a cost the audience could see, not something that appeared in headlines or performances, but a personal cost, a quiet cost, the cost of constantly shifting between who you are and who you have to be. The cost of living in two realities at once. And over time, that kind of life changes a person. It reshapes them. It pulls them in different directions until even they might not fully know where one version ends and the other begins. That was the truth Lisa Marie carried. The real Elvis was never missing. He was never completely gone. He was always there, but not always in the place people were looking. The world searched for him on stage, in the spotlight, in the moments of perfection. But according to her, that wasn't where the full truth lived. The real Elvis existed in the quiet, in the private moments, in the spaces where no one was watching. He existed in the parts of life that weren't meant for an audience. And maybe that's why so many people never saw him, because they were looking in the wrong place. In the end, Lisa Marie didn't try to change her father's legacy. She didn't ask the world to see him differently. She simply shared what she knew, that the man behind the legend was more complex, more human, and more real than anyone could fully understand from the outside. She didn't take anything away from the magic of Elvis Presley. She added something to it, a deeper layer, a more honest perspective, a reminder that behind every icon there is a person, and that person doesn't always exist in the way the world expects. So when people say the real Elvis was never on stage, it doesn't mean the performances weren't real. It doesn't mean the connection wasn't genuine. It means something much more human. It means that what the world saw was only one part of a much bigger story, a story that lived beyond the spotlight, beyond the music, beyond the legend itself. And maybe that's the most powerful truth of all. The king the world loved was real, but the man behind him was even more real.